Right, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our annual event of the DMC Forum. And it's also a real pleasure to see some of the faces of the audience present here, some also friends at CBS. So welcome also to the audience here in the room. Now, last year, our annual event took place a few days before the release of the DMA, the EU proposal for regulations of the digital markets. Now, at that time, much of the debate was still really about whether we needed new tools and regulatory frameworks for the digital economy. A year later, that is kind of taken for granted. And the debate has now rapidly moved to what the new principles for such regulation should be, rather than whether we need some and what the objectives should be part of such framework. So for instance, the DMA explicitly refers to two guiding principles, fairness and contestability. Yet what these principles mean conceptually and in practice is left largely undefined in the text. And that is problematic, I believe, on two fronts. First, it might lead to a fragmented regulatory environment whereby each regulator comes with its own set of obligations and restrictions without a clear anchoring principle. Something that unfortunately we're starting seeing in Europe, but also, of course, with other legislations abroad. And second, I will limit the ability to develop coherent criteria of applications of such provisions. At a more fundamental level is also the question of whether the current regulatory proposals are capturing the essence and the underlying dynamics of the digital economy. So the discussion in our past events that we host here on the forum over the past year has clearly revealed that current proposal for short and properly accounting for the fact that ecosystems, not markets, are dictating the rules of the game, and with them, the competition and innovation dynamics in the digital space. So what are ecosystems? If we mention them all the time and distinct from the markets. Now, in the management science, we see them as new collective organizations, basically new ways to organize inter-firm productions and innovation to offer integrated solutions to the customer. More broadly, they can be taught as new structures of economic relationships binding a set of firms. So whereas markets establish points of contact between sellers and buyers, ecosystems establish points of contact between multiple firms who need each other to offer a value proposition to the final customer. And so in some cases, what we observe there in the digital economy now is that platforms are the medium to create both these linkages among firms, and so we have ecosystems, and with customers, and so we have marketplaces. But those are still distinct phenomena, yet they are interrelated. And another notable example of this is smartphones and apps, things that we all are familiar with, where we have two competing ecosystems at the moment, or the large one, based on the iOS and Android platform, and two distinct marketplaces, which are based, which are basically the App Store and the Google Play. Now, fairness and contestability, as defined or proposed in the DMA, seem to apply exclusively to only one set of these aspects, to platform marketplaces, but fail to account for the role of ecosystems in shaping these markets, and more generally for competition between ecosystems. So we think that this and potential ecosystem failures in creating and delivering value to customers should be rather the object of analysis and guide the principles of regulations digital markets. So here we are to relaunch the debate on platform regulation by taking a step back and asking this more profound question. What are good principles of regulation in digital markets? What do we mean by that? And today, we are fortunate to have a terrific lineup of speakers to discuss these issues. Most of many of the scholars that have been contributing to develop the concept of ecosystem and have done work in this area and platforms since some of the dates that backs to standards battles. And starting with our keynote speakers who do not need introductions, and Professor Frédéric Jenny and Marshall from Alstyne. We then have two outstanding panels on the issues with competition in and between ecosystems and how to move forward. We'll introduce them when we get to the discussion, but you can also look at their bio in the website, but you will recognize very familiar face. And we will close with some remarks from Martin Thelle on the implementation side of the proposed regulation. So when we move to how do we understand this and how do we implement, we like to hear also the voice from practitioners. So as usual, I have the pleasure to moderate the debate with my colleague and with the help of my colleague Juan Santaló from CBS. And thank you all for joining the forum. So I hope you will enjoy the discussion. Please, use as usual the chat and everything to interact with the speakers. And I also invite the speaker to share their own set of material and papers and articles, whatever they feel appropriate through the chat of Zoom. So I now leave the floor to our first speaker, Frédéric Jenny, Professor of Economics at the SEC Business School and Chairman of the OECD Competition Committee, who will discuss the gaps with the current regulatory approach and take us to learn to walk before we run. Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to start from a competition law agency point of view. And I would say that competition law agencies, competition authorities are facing a crisis. A number of issues have been raised about them. Some argue that the goals of competition law are too narrow. Some argue that the focus of competition authorities is too concentrated on short time and pricing effects. Some argue that the procedures are too slow and that merger control is inadequate to take into consideration dynamic efficiencies. And a big part, not the whole part, but a big part of this debate on the future of competition authority is based on the feeling that competition authorities have failed in their mission, particularly with respect to digital sector, both at the substantial level and at the procedural level. Now, competition authorities themselves, I think, are frustrated with their inability to rein in digital firms with the competition tools that they have. And in various jurisdictions, there have been requests by competition authorities for the adoption of ex-ante regulatory tools. Others have suggested that it is the foundation of competition law that should be changed, and that the Chicago School has perverted competition. The question I want to discuss is why competition authorities have experienced difficulties dealing with the digital sector at the substantive level, what to do about it while preserving the principles on which competition law rests. My presentation is based on a couple of papers that I recently published. My main message is that antitrust has to be adapted to the digital sector because most of the instruments that are used in competition law enforcement are not adapted to the reality of the digital sector. If competition authorities do not adapt their tools, there is a serious risk that as competition authorities will be displaced by sectoral regulators, and that the relevance of competition law enforcement will be questioned more and more, or that the pressure to change the goal of competition will be corrupted by considerations of fairness or even populism. Now, my starting point is that there are important lessons to be derived from the business literature on digital ecosystems to understand the specificities of the digital ecosystems and what they imply for competition law enforcement. Let me start with the obvious. To assess what is not competition on the merits, And we know that in competition law, violations of the competition law are considered to be behavior that are not competition on the merits. In order to assess what is not competition on the merits, one has to have a clear understanding of how competition works in the digital sector. But there are a number of specificities to keep in mind to understand how competition works in the digital field. First, as you have just mentioned, in the digital sector, competition is largely a competition between ecosystems, which I will just loosely define as a core platform providing some services directly and combining them with other services from complementers. The relationship between the platform and its complementers is organized by the governance rules imposed by the platform. That is a condition for having access to the platform. And those do raise questions of competition within the platform. And the best example of this has been the cases on Booking.com and the imposition by the platform of a condition of a price parity clause on the hotels or the lodging which was proposed on the platform. But the relationship between the core platform and the complementers or the users of the platform is going to be crucial for the attractiveness of the ecosystem, and therefore is going to be crucial to competition between ecosystems. So this point is a point which I think is quite important. We're going to get back to it. But the point is that competition conditions within the ecosystem will determine conditions of competition between the ecosystems. Now, this is an issue which competition authorities should be familiar with, because a few years ago, they were faced when they dealt with vertical restraints with exactly the same issue. Vertical restraint is a reduction of intra-brand competition, which may have the effect to increase inter-brand competition. Now, what is striking is that, for example, if I take the EU, in the Google Android case, which is right now being discussed in front of the Court of First Instance, the EU did not recognize the interaction between the Google Android system and or platform, sorry, and the Apple platform. This is, as you know, one of the main arguments which is being presented to the court these days by Google, which is the fact that the way it relates to its complementers is instrumental in allowing it to compete with the Apple system. Well, when you read the decision of the EU, you see that first there is a declaration that Google and Apple are not competing with each other. Therefore, Google has a dominant position on its system, and therefore we can decide that what it does with respect to its complementers is an abuse of this dominant position. So the work that we have done on vertical restraint 30 years ago, we have to do now, or competition authorities have to do it now, in order to have more meaningful decisions when they look at the competition issue between the platform and its complementers. The second dimension is economies of scope. Now, economies of scope do not have a very high profile in competition law. Yet, one of the important features of digital ecosystems that they benefit from economies of scope in at least two areas. First, the algorithm which they use to create an interaction between various set of users or complementers can be used to deliver a number of different services. And second, the data which is collected by the core platform tracking the interaction between its users can be used to better understand those consumers, target offers of many different services that they may want. Now, the fact that ecosystems benefit from scope economies means that unlike pipeline firms, they are multi-market operations and do not necessarily have a center of gravity in one market. Instagram photo app became a social media, Amazon, a book retailer, became a producer and distributor of films, etc. Therefore, competition between ecosystems is not primarily a competition between firms on a market, but a competition between ecosystems across markets. Thus, the notion of relevant market, which is crucial in competition law in other sectors, which must be defined a priori to assess competition, loses a lot of its relevance when we're talking about competition between ecosystems. Next, because platform control a technology to allow the different users to interact, and because a platform is successful when it offers an attractive combination of services, competition between ecosystem is competition between bundles of services. This means that potential competitors to an ecosystem are other ecosystems who can offer a more interesting or valuable bundle of services. Those competing bundles do not necessarily have the exact same services, and we've seen example of this recently. Thus, the potential competition of an ecosystem may be another ecosystem which is doing something largely different on the market. Now, this is both an economic and a legal problem related to the concept of potential competition in competition law. The first problem is the problem of understanding who could compete with whom between ecosystems. And the inability of competition authorities to identify potential competitors can have two effects. In the Facebook-Instagram case merger, the OFT did not believe that Instagram could compete with Facebook and therefore didn't block the merger because it didn't think that the merger created a potential problem. So this is a case where the OFT did not realize that there was potential competition between two platforms. On the other hand, when considering whether mergers can have a potential anti-competitive effect, competition authorities tend to ignore the impact of potential competitors and therefore to be more restrictive vis-a-vis those mergers than is justified. The second problem is a legal problem. In many jurisdictions, the legal standard for potential competition is that requires that the potential competitor must be already in the relevant market before it can be considered to be a potential competitor. Now, this may have a meaning in non-digital markets, but for the reasons which I have mentioned earlier, it doesn't have much sense. It doesn't make much sense in the digital sector. Ecosystems operate as interfaces between various sets of service providers and users, and this means that they will operate on multi-sided markets. Not two-sided markets, but multi-sided markets. Typically, users on one side, ad developers, including core platforms, suppliers of services, and advertisers. This in turn means that competing ecosystems can have widely different business models. Apple monetizes its services with the sale of sophisticated terminals. Google sells cheap the Google platform is sold on cheap terminals and therefore wants a maximum of users and charges the advertiser to access those users. So two different business models. Now, the fact that competing ecosystems have different business models and therefore different relationship between the core platform and the complementers is not entirely unknown in the non-digital sector. And one example would be the competition between free TV and pay TV. But it is uncommon. And what it means is that competition issue may be specific to one competitor and not applicable to all competitors. Next, platforms aim to benefit from direct and indirect network effects. Network effects are assumed by competition authorities to be a structural characteristic of many digital markets. But the existence of network effects are a function of the quality and the diversity of services offered by platforms and of the technology or the algorithm used by the platform. So network effects can be weak, for example, for a video gaming platform, or they can be strong. They can disappear over time. For example, Windows was displaced by internet-based operating systems. They can become stronger as a result of the strategy of firms. For example, Amazon through a system of comments and references, created a network effect. The strengthening and the management of the direct and indirect network effect is a crucial dimension of the strategy of the platforms. Thus, network effects are not entirely an exogenous and stable factors, and competition authorities have to understand the dynamics of network effects to assess their importance as a barrier to entry or their ability to be overcome. Next, I would say that to succeed and successfully compete, a platform and an ecosystem must be able to offer, first, a technically superior or innovative service or set of services. You can have Spotify, for example, in mind, which displays music streaming platforms. B, a management of the network effect, as I've just mentioned. 3, the building of a large set of users to benefit from the network effects. And 4, the ability to find a business model to monetize the user base. And from that point of view, for example, it's not yet obvious that Spotify has found a business model which is a stable one. Now, it is not obvious that a small startup has the ability to gather all those skills. And the focus on the acquisition of platforms on the functionality of the platform rather than on the complementarity of the requirements for the platform to be successful can lead competition authorities astray. Competition for users between ecosystems is largely a competition on quality and innovation. TikTok adopted the technology which Facebook did not have, allowing the sharing of small videos. Spotify displaced Napsters and iTunes in providing a service where consumers would be in control of their choice of music and where the music would be delivered instantly, etc., etc. This means that the Stiglerian static price competition model is not adequate and must be replaced by a concept of competition in a more Schumpeterian environment where competition through innovation is the main point. Finally, data. The ability to gather data and to treat data is absolutely crucial in many ecosystems. And data has a possibility of being a barrier to entry, particularly because the treatment of data through artificial intelligence favors large set of data and therefore large firms. But data is not always a barrier to entry. TikTok, Spotify, Instagram were able to develop without a large database. So more is needed in terms of understanding when access to data is an impossible barrier to entry, a barrier to entry impossible to break. More is needed on how to deal with the fact that the use of large sets of data may be a barrier to entry because it allows platform to offer a better personalized service and therefore allows platform and ecosystem to increase welfare as it reduces potential competition. Now, as you mentioned earlier, the Digital Market Act is an attempt to replace ex post analysis by ex ante regulation at the EU level. But a lot of the criticism which has been voiced directly to the DMA, at least to the proposed DMA, is related to the point that I've just made. Some of this criticism is the fact that the DMA doesn't propose a coherent set of obligations resulting from a general framework of analysis, but is based on past decisions, the outcome of which is directly transposed as obligations. Second, the DMA imposes economically unjustified rigidities in the digital sector practices, which reduce competition, may have often efficiency benefits, and this is not recognized. The DMA does not adjust the obligation to the business model of the platform. The DMA deals with competition within ecosystem the relationship between the platform of its complementers, but says nothing about competition between ecosystem. And as a result, it does not promote consumer welfare. And finally, the DMA does nothing to separate the positive efficiency effects and welfare gains that platform generates through data-driven network effects from the negative anti-competitive and welfare-reducing behaviors of platforms. So what do we have to do? Well, in order for competition authority to be able to deal with the digital sector, there are a number of things which are urgently required. They must consider competition between ecosystem and its relationship within to competition within ecosystems. First, they should analyze competition across markets rather than competition within markets. They must establish principles of competition law enforcement when competition is a Schumpeterian competition. They must find the adequate instrument to replace the market power indicators, which are based on the relationship between price and cost, which doesn't make sense necessarily in the digital sector. They must allow for the fact that competition may have different business, platforms may have different business model, which means that competition concerns and remedy may vary within a competition case from one competitor to another. They must explore the notion of potential competition in the digital sector and adapt the jurisprudence accordingly. They must study when data accumulation is a barrier to entry. And finally, they must reconsider the treatment of efficiencies. Now, all those are major changes in the way we look at competition law, but they are absolutely necessary if competition authorities are going to deal with the digital sector. That's what I wanted to say.
So thank you very much, Fred. I mean, this was a terrific introduction to several points for the discussion. And if you're able to stay with us, please also you can join into the discussion. So we're going to pick up on several of the points that you just mentioned here, of what is now the current gap and how do we get there. So thank you, and let's move now to the first panel discussion then. Inviting on the stage virtually our first set of speakers in the panel on exactly some of these points, understanding issues with competition, not just within, but between or across ecosystems, and how the two interrelate, and what are the set of therefore gaps and issues that we're not considering. So we have Michael Jacobides, Professor of Strategy, LBS, who is a top leader when it comes to ecosystems, and has also put a different hat recently as a writer or contributor to writing and drafting competition law and for the Greek government, and maybe is going to speak also about that. We have Alex De Streel, also well known for professor in competition law, and who I guess has a less of a critical stance on the DMA and has a clear view of what the principles and objectives are, although they might not be stated clearly in the draft. Juan Santaló, Professor of Strategy from IE Business School, a person who I'm also particularly attached, as it was my supervisor when I started studying these platforms at the time, where people were looking at me when with a blank face when I was saying multi-sided platforms, markets. And Thomas Kude, who is joining us from SEC Business School in a state of hopefully not confusion, but fever. So thank you again also for staying with us despite your health condition. So starting with Michael, I come to you as a very consequential, I think, link with the past speaker on competition issues in ecosystems, and what do we do with that? I mean, what are the standing gaps, and should we look at markets? Should we look at ecosystems? How do we look at these things? How do we think about it?
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. And it's a huge amount to cover. So let me try to help this with a bit of a visual background, if I may. A few thoughts. So we all know all the flurry of activity and excitement that has happened with the reports that have done a terrific job in 2019, laying out the groundwork And of course, we've got in 2020 the DMA and the discussion that has followed it. And to some extent, especially looking at the DMA, I am, although I'm not a lawyer myself, I'm actually thinking of Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, who in his discussion of Ohio versus Jacobides, speaking of pornography, he says, I know it when I see it. So my sense in terms of the power of platforms is that we've got a bit of, I know it when I see it. And as far as the Europeans go, they are American, they're big, we don't run them, they're annoying, we need to restrict them. I'm only partly jesting, and some of the work that we did do in reviewing part of the underlying principles was looking into it. And I think that like others have recently pointed out, to some extent, the DMA looks like a summary of some of the ongoing cases against some of the platforms, which is good in as much as it tackles some of the current issues, but it's not terribly good when you think that we are right now starting to look at a new set of issues that need to be directly addressed. And I guess that one of the things that I've done, you mentioned a little bit earlier, Carmelo, my other hat in terms of the Competition Commission with its president and my quarter and a couple of things. Yannis Lianos is speaking about how we need to start thinking about ecosystem failures, not just market failures. So let's get the thinking straight here. When we speak about ecosystems, I think we speak about two different things, and it needs to be clear that we're speaking about these bundles that are offered to the consumer through digital means, which are the multi-product ecosystems. And we also are speaking about the groups of organizations that come together in each one of these verticals, as it were, in order to cover it. This is a pure schematic, but I do think that getting our verbiage there right is important. Part of that, just to give a plug to the sequel to the 2018 SMJ that Carmelo, Annabel Gauer, and I wrote, is in what I hope will be coming out fairly soon in another of the similar journals in the field. Now, what's interesting is that we're not just speaking about big tech doing it. If you start looking around and you look at Sber, I just was speaking with them yesterday, you see that Sber is not called Sberbank. They were not content being the most profitable bank in Europe. They decided that to make money, you need to be an ecosystem. You need to ensure that you capture everyone. Why? Because they understand how they can manipulate customers, frankly. And I'm a little bit torn because half of my work, which is advising companies, also is the one that makes me see what are the anti-competitive results. And this is also where we're seeing the potential impact of regulators. Because when the Chinese started saying that's happening, they started telling Ant Group, you're not going to be able to do that. Sber is still betting that the Anti-Monopoly Commission in Russia will not quite force them to do what the Chinese are forcing the Ant to do. And it'll be interesting to see how we consider it as the landscape is changing. Now, I think that what we need to do is not focus on the Judge Porter Stewart. Well, let's take something that takes care of the big people, the big firms that are a problem, but something that is a little bit more robust. I was slightly disappointed only because Frédéric Jenny said, I am publishing this in a paper. I should say that this is the lead paper in a special issue where the majority of the panel is actually presenting that I co-edited with Yannis Lianos in Industrial and Corporate Change, which is a special issue on regulating platforms and ecosystems. And has been fantastic editing this volume because I admit that I am much the wiser about many of these dynamics. I warmly commend the paper of Frédéric Jenny, as well as our other keynote speaker, Marshall van Alstyne, and other participants that you would see here. And we're trying to provide a bit of an overview. And I think we need to think about how the law approaches these issues. Let me just offer something, not from the introduction, probably the most approachable of the documents that I wrote for the special issue, but from the paper that I wrote with Yannis Lianos in competition ecosystems and competition law, where our argument is that competition law has generally evolved as it has faced new phenomenological issues. And when you look at it evolving to account for aftermarkets and two-sided platforms and production platforms and transaction platforms, it adjusted. And I think that a similar type of adjustment is needed now that we're looking at ecosystems that are raising fundamentally different, qualitatively different issues. And that's why I also chafe a little bit at the numeric limit saying a platform is a gatekeeper if it's got 6.5 billion or 65 billion or whatever the number is, which I understand pragmatically, but I really don't think are helping us to understand what the nature of the problems are, and we should absolutely move away from them as soon as we possibly can. I get the realpolitik. I've been looking at politics, but I don't think that as a field we should support that. I think that what we are looking is that platforms or ecosystems are not just platforms. Clearly, there are issues, and people have started speaking about understanding business models, and the CMA is starting to move in this direction, which I think is a good idea. I certainly understand why the Anglo-Saxonic common sense will not work in the Franco-Germanic legal tradition, but on the other hand, I think that it is going to be very difficult to have the ex-ante rules that perhaps we would want to have. I do think that we need to be a little bit more careful in thinking about business models. A moment ago, I provided a very rough overview of what the scope, the nature, the shape of the Google model is. And this is from the recent paper we did with Evolution Limited, something that analyzes the business model of it. And then essentially, we need to follow the money. We need to understand what can lead to excesses, and then what are the practices that we should try to curtail. We need to start thinking at issues like the governance of the platforms and the ecosystems, things that are already starting to attract some research, but probably not enough. And I think that once we start doing that, when we start getting serious about analyzing the structural features that tell us whether we have an ecosystem failure, which is specific to the way these ecosystems work. So I think that what I'm saying is very much complementary to what Frédéric Jenny just presented you, and also says in greater detail at his paper, which, as I mentioned, I warmly commend, is to think about how these structural features may be important and may even tell us whether competition between ecosystems is sufficient to allow for the outcomes that we would want. Now, that could have some criteria, and I would favor dropping these rather rough and I think intellectually wholly indefensible ideas of numbers telling us what is a gatekeeper and what is not, American South, Europeans in, and focus instead on attributes that tell us if a particular orchestrator has gatekeeper power. So in another paper, I'm looking at issues like exclusive customer access, consumer lock-in, limited seller bargaining power, and so on and so forth. Let me just illustrate it in the 30 seconds that I have. Consider two ecosystems that compete. One of these two cases is going to be Android versus iPhone. The other is going to be two ride-sharing platforms. With Android versus iPhone, pretty much all of the clients multi-home. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you want to access people with an iPhone, you do need to, whether you like it or not, go through Apple, regardless of the market share that it has in the market, even if it were 3%, not 7%. The more important thing is that even if you have a player with big network externalities, and the example that I have is from the dating market, consider Tinder, you can't simply say, well, Tinder can move away from the iPhone because people in an Android saying, I want to date people who have an iPhone. As a result, because of network externalities, ironically, the developers need to, because of the uni-homing of the clients, need to be essentially singing to the tune that they offer. They have a lot of power, and this is a very important asymmetry. Consider, on the other hand, two different ecosystems, which are platforms, Uber and Lyft. They have the possibility of multi-homing. Each driver can be at the same time in multiple platforms. You can open on your phone multiple different services to see which is it that is going to give me the best service and the best availability, and I can switch immediately. What does that mean? Well, to me, that one is an ecosystem, it is a gatekeeper, not just the ecosystem orchestrator, and the other is not. Why is this important? Well, it is important because two of them are going to be enough to be competitive in the ride-hailing example. Two of them will absolutely not be enough for anything like competition in the operating system example. So if we start by thinking theoretically and conceptually what the problems are. And if we articulate them in ways that do more than the judge Potter Stewart, well, geopolitics will inevitably play an important role. And anyone who's been involved in policymaking understands how these decisions are taken. I think that we will end up helping customers, helping our role, and the integrity with which we can do it. So these were my quick thoughts, and let me stop sharing and start learning from the other panelists.
Thank you, Michael.
Michael, maybe I have a question for you that actually comes from both your presentation and the previous one. I mean, I understand that we talk about a very different context than before, but are you saying that we cannot use any of the regulatory toolboxes that we had before? Are we talking about totally new environment with totally new toolbox?
I would say
we use something.
Well, obviously we reuse something, but what I'm saying is that we need to identify things that make an ecosystem structurally unfair, like the existence of gatekeepers. This can only be seen on the basis of some criteria that we need to articulate. Here, for instance, I articulated these 5 criteria in this working paper where I'm like, well, what are these features and how can we start looking at these different platforms or the ecosystems that they create? We also need to start looking at things that relate to the ecosystem power. It isn't that you're going to throw away the things that you knew already. It is that you are adjusting the same principles and you are updating them in order to make them relevant for today. I mean, that may have been a bias of mine in the way that I approach academic work, which is that I think it is too facile to say we need to get rid of stuff. But what I'm saying is that when we have new categories of problems, we need to spend a bit of time understanding what is the nature of issues that we have. We're also trying to discuss it in the introduction to the special issue with Yanis. Llanos, happy to send to your participants the link to the special issue. I think most papers are going to be open access and they're going to be available in about a week or so. And I think that starting the debate and trying to understand what it means for policymaking, which, by the way, to go back to that, Carmelo, was the reason that I got a little bit involved in writing this law that is going to be voted in the Greek parliament over the next week, is what I think could be useful. But more of that, hopefully a little later.
Thank you. Please share the link to the artisans for also doing that. So, no, moving to Alex. You know, we heard here about, you know, a couple of things, structural features, right? I mean, from Michael, that are those that impede, right, some of this or create some of the failures. And then, you know, the reference from Fed to, you know, Schumpeterian type of environment and competition. So going more into the dynamic competition that, you know, favoring innovation and, you know, you're less critical about, right? I mean, what the DMA is trying to achieve, because precisely, I mean, your point would be that precisely that's part of what is in the law. Would you clarify maybe on that? Or you give our, you know, our points?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. So maybe I'm less critical because I'm not part of your ecosystem in a way, because I am a lawyer and most of you, I mean, some of you are, but most of you are not. And so maybe that explains the difference. No, more seriously, I think that just to jump on what Michael just said, I fully agree with him that we need some criteria, that multi-homing is one of the main criteria. But the good news is that we have that to some extent in the DMA. So it's not like pornography where you see it when you, I mean, you know it when you see it, or it's not an anti-US sperm, I mean, US law. I think we have those criteria, maybe they are not articulated enough, I would agree. So maybe we should work a little bit better, but I think the potential is there. You know? And so I think the work that Michael has done is very important. And what I hope is at some point, you know, we will have some guidance of the Commission on how the gatekeeper will be designated beyond the just quantitative indicators, which remember, those quantitative indicators is just creating a rebuttable presumption. It is not the alpha and the omega of the designation. And so then, with the help of Michael, maybe that could be the next work after the Greek law, is the Commission guidelines on the criteria to rebut a presumption or to designate a gatekeeper. But I want to say another thing, and because it's a bit the same line, I think that if you want, the DMA is a good start, but it's not a finished product, and there is a lot of reason to that. I think the Commission was in a rush to do it. And because, we heard often that the objectives are not clear. Yes, it's contestability and fairness, but contestability is not defined. And fairness is more defined as a distributional element. And we have a list of obligations, and Carmelo, you recall that, which is a kind of a catalog of the previous antitrust case, but maybe, and Michael repeat that also, it's not future-proof. What I want to do, I think that it is true, but on the other hand, if you look at the obligation, you can in a way reconstruct a better objective, So it's implicit in the law, and maybe it would be better that it's explicit in the text. But, I think the law has two main objectives. One is to protect sustaining innovation by the user of the platform, and when you are in the same ecosystem. Okay, so because the risk, of course, is that if you are a platform, if you orchestrate an ecosystem, you want to control innovation yourself, and you can have some tying or self-preferencing behavior, which would then impede a new innovator to innovate within the ecosystem. Okay, and I think some obligation, like the prohibition of some time, of some leveraging, or some interoperability obligation, will allow, in fact, user to innovate themselves within the ecosystem. So that is promoting sustaining innovation. And then we have another big objective behind the DMA, which is protecting disruptive innovation. Because I would agree with the people who say that frontal competition or inter-platform competition, as Frédéric Jenny was mentioning before, maybe make less sense here than in a more traditional sector. Clearly, we have seen that innovation progressed more through sideway competition than to frontal competition. Okay, and so what is very important if you intervene in those markets is to protect those disruptors and to be sure that they can indeed enter in the market. And how you do that? How you do that in two ways. First, you have to ensure that on the supply side, or let's say on the firm side, the platform remain relatively open for the disruptor. And more importantly, on the demand side, on the customer side, you have a user mobility, which can go from the existing players to the disruptor. Okay, so I think, for instance, all the obligations regarding data portability are going in that direction. So, if you think of it, you can reread those obligations. I agree it's not clear, but that's what we have tried to do in a paper with Pierre Laroche, and I will mention the reference in the chat in a minute. But we have tried to reinterpret, let's say, the list of obligations according to those two objectives: protecting sustaining innovation, protecting disruptive innovation, and it fits relatively well, And so maybe that is what contestability means. Contestability is leaving the market open to be sure that innovator can enter. And if you think of it, it's not very new. And this is why we call our paper a revolution grounded on tradition, because in fact, it's the old order liberal conception of the antitrust or the economic policy intervention. You have to keep the market open for the innovator to come.
Thank you, Alex. So just to follow up, right? And are we risking? So there's a point in what Fred was mentioning before, right? That we need to look more into this interconnection between what's happening within the ecosystem and what's happening across the ecosystem. So some of the failures within ecosystem competition that might affect, right? I mean, between competition and might create some of the structural barriers and features that also Michael was referring. So do you think that by just addressing these issues, right? I mean, between the platform essentially and those competing and getting access to the ecosystem is enough to solve also the other set of issues? So the others are consequential, or do we need to look also at the role that ecosystem, we will say orchestrations, right? So the coordination has for value creation. So granting also the ability of the firm, to exclude access to its own, asset.
Now, two things. So first, I think we are, I mean, you are at the very beginning of understanding all of that. And so clearly, I mean, the DMA is not the end of the process. I mean, it's just a first generation law and it's there to stay. So I think it will learn. And I think what is very important is that the enforcer of that law will be able to learn as they enforce the law. So clearly, I mean, more needs to be done. Now on whether the relationship between ecosystem is sufficiently taken into account in the law as it is proposed, probably not. I fully agree with that. And so that's probably where I see a kind of a progress that needs to be made as the enforcement will go along, because it's true that too often, you know, the ecosystem concept is not even there. And I think that is a bit, I mean, that is a pity, but also the relationship between ecosystem is not very well understood. That's clear.
Thank you very much. So we move to the next panelist, Juan. And, you know, you've been heard the different arguments, but what is your take on this, on the effectiveness of, you know, what's being proposed and how we are tackling these issues on intra and inter ecosystem competition?
Okay, so thank you, Carmelo. Thank you very much for the invitation, right? I would like to start a bit. I said something. I saw something at the SMS that I'm going to copy now. I mean, I should copy to state my conflicts of interest, right? So I have done work for the Society of Spain of publishers of newspapers and writers, and clearly this association has had some impact against the two of the big four, right? So you should say keep this in mind while using my opinions. But also, on the other time, also, you know, Facebook is helping us in AI to organize a workshop that has provides hopefully a better link between research and data. So maybe, you know, some bias in the other direction, right? So very quickly, these are my bias, maybe. Now, for this, for the question, right, that you're posing, Carmelo, I have been puzzled by the evolution, right? So I know this was the topic of the last year workshop that you said, right? I mean, puzzled by the evolution in which so quickly we have moved, right, from being accepting consumer surplus the way to decide at what point, you know, competition policy should be effective, and nowadays more and more we're having more just we have to protect competition per se, right? And it's not puzzled by the evolution. We have heard the news and we see what's going on. And I think basically what's going on is the lack of empirical evidence in favor of this. And for this, I want to connect it with Michael's points, right? So Michael's, you know, I agree 100% with his point about, you know, why do we have to have this market capitalization, these number issues, right? Why not general principles? I agree 100% with this. Alex also mentioned this. I think if you think about this philosophically, what's going on, right, is what happened when the Antitrust and Competition Act happened in 1890. Right? So at the other day, right, more than empirical evidence, and I will explain this a little bit later, that we are destroying competition, innovation, choice, right? More than empirical evidence in favor of that, what we are really having is like a threat of companies that are big, right? And therefore, you know, why do we have these big numbers? I would say, right, we have these big numbers because I think, I might be wrong, right, that it has to be clear we are going against the big four, right? And therefore, you know, we cannot name them, but we name the numbers, right? With market cap, that's very clear, right? Okay, so that's comment on aside. Now, the principles, right, and the competition between ecosystems within ecosystems, right? You asked me to focus more on the not on weak contestability, but on fair practices, right? And for this, you know, when you go over the DMA about fair practices, right? Fair practices for what? So what are the failures, right? And therefore, you know, they measure, of course, prices, right? What will happen if, I don't know, the App Store decrease commission from 30% to 15%, that's nice. But more importantly, right, when you drive what are the failures, what is behind the motivation, this big push for this new regulation is innovation, right? So the lack of incentive for innovation, you want product innovation as well, including product variety in this case, right? And in this, right, and when I translate the numbers, and I went over the impact assessment done for the DMA, right, they mentioned that there is, they call it literally, I'm going to read, unrealized potential of the platform economy between 3.9 and 15 billion euros a year, a humongous amount, right? Most of this comes from innovation, right? So the failures are coming from innovation. We have to link fair practices, that has to be fair, or lack of fair practices, sorry, towards this unrealized potential linked through innovation. And for this, right? I have not been active in the regulatory debate. I follow this, as you know, Carmelo, more to my work with you about the evolution of ecosystems, right? And for this, what I see, like, is that we're missing, I'm going to stress a lot of this, is a lack of linkage between the size of the incentives to do more or less innovation and these particular unfair practices, right? When we are looking for these guiding principles to try to land these DMA or other type of regulation practices, right? I think an angle I'm missing personally, right? And I see that maybe biased, I have my biases, is always looking at the incentives to do more or less innovation. And in particular, right, when you go over the documents and you go over the DMA or the impact assessment, all of them, what I see, right, or my feeling, my understanding, is they take as given the incentives to innovate of the big platforms, right, the platform sponsors, right, the producers of these ecosystems. And therefore, they take these innovations to, these incentives to innovate as given, and this focused analysis on the impact of these unfair practices, let's say, upon the incentives to innovate of the complementers, or the producers of the complementary products. Taken as given, assuming it is the case. Now, I went very quickly, right, because I was not sure about this, so I went over the documents in which I tried to justify these particular explanations, and they cite references, right, the work of Parter and Alstyne, our speaker Ness, I saw some work of Kevin Boudreau. But when you go over these documents to infer from this that these big platforms have a lack of incentives to innovate, I think it's a big step. And let me just give you an example, and with this I'm going to be done, right? So the example is like, very specifically in some of these unfair competition practices, right? The DMA states that, the dominant platforms or gatekeepers, or however you want to call them, they cannot use the data in an unfair manner when they are competing against their own complementers, against their own applications, right? So they even go to the state that whatever data they have, it has to be shared. That's another of the principles they are proposing the DMA. Now, from this, right, there's one obvious point, right? It's like, who has more incentives to innovate under which conditions? It's true, maybe, complementers are going to have less incentives to innovate, but what about the big platforms? And therefore in the debate, I can give you some references of recent work about this. But more importantly, right, and that's linked with my talk with experiences. Just yesterday, I was talking to a guy that's specialized, an ex-student of mine, that is doing a lot of these algorithms, big data, data science, right, for different companies. And, with this conversation with him, stressed me this idea that usually academics or regulators, right, we take data as given. So data is magic, and this is already produced and we use it. And then, of course, if these companies, these big gatekeepers have access to this data, they have to share it because it's not unfair. And the big point that I think I want to stress this point again, and sorry if I'm repetitive, is that this data has to be produced, right? And the example I was telling you, right? And I cannot name the name of the company, right? But this is one of the leaders in Europe of food delivery. And therefore, what he was doing, and this has been a huge project with several million euros, has to be dealing with the data they receive from customers that order the food delivery. And up to now, their algorithms, the data, right? Basically, they were using just the amount of the ticket on one hand, and the addresses of both, let's say, the restaurant and the customer. Therefore, they had to do a humongous project to add information about what is in the order, right? And therefore, of course, they were doing this because once you know what's in the order, you can improve your predictability of how long it will take. It's different. You take one very complicated cuisine where you're taking just a couple of ice creams. Right? I know this is obvious, but it states the fact that data is not just there. You have to produce it to do something useful. And I want to stress, and that's my main point, that one of these guiding principles that we are things like that we are forgetting, we said at one point we go in one direction or the other, is don't forget the incentives, right, of these gatekeepers to produce data and to innovate, right? That was very in the results. So yes, that's all, Carmelo.
Thank you, Juan.
Thank you, Juan. I was wondering a little bit, because for me, when I'm thinking of digital ecosystems, I don't think of matchmakers. I think of innovation enablers towards complementers. So it's a little bit difficult to grasp this notion of unfair or need for fair practices, if you wish, or incentives, because for me, the actual nature of these ecosystems is about incentives to complementers to create value, and therefore also for the ecosystems to generate value. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
You have lost Juan.
Absolutely, right. So I agree with you that that's the whole name of the thinking in fairness. It can drive to mistakes because what is fair is independent of what we want. Because that's very clear what we want, and we want is to align incentives to create innovations, I think, right? Versus what can be fair or cannot be fair. It can be unfair practices to develop more and more innovation, right? And just let me stress, I mean, this is a work that has not been published, it's not by me, but I was lucky enough to see this in SMS, right? And therefore, you know, this is work of, I had the name, I hope I pronounce it right, Stanchenkeri and Katila, right? It's work in progress in SMS. And they had this paper where they did something that honestly, I think we should have done many, many years ago, right? They go back to the Microsoft antitrust case, end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st, and they look at the impact of this trial, right? On innovation, but not innovation on the consumer side, innovation on the business side, right? Because I mean, maybe more hidden, right? There was all these implications about the Windows server, not just the Windows for consumers. And she does this investigation, right? And see what happens with, after this, with the innovation of the complementors, as you were saying, that's the right thing to do, the aligning of incentives. And they find, what they find is great. I mean, it's preliminary work, we know, but it's terribly interesting. They have two things that are opposite signs. On one side, they find the strong effect that indeed, right, once you have the antitrust case and they have a very sophisticated analysis and very complete, I would say, to defend causality, right, always the issue. And they find that indeed is the case that these applications, right, these complementors, indeed innovate more after, Microsoft is forced to not to compete with their own application, and as explained in the trial. But at the same time, so this is way in favor of more this intervention. But at the same time, they find something that I think is terribly interesting. And what they do find is the profitability of these complementors after this go down. Of course, compared to a treatment control group, after the trial, etc. So why profitability goes down, right? And of course, that's, there's no very good way to know. But one of the explanations they propose is like the gatekeeper, right? In this case, Microsoft had less incentives, it is more, to produce the complementary assets. And this meant they had to do it by themselves. And this meant that maybe they had other undesirable effects. My whole point again, right, as a long answer to your question, sorry, is like for every situation, a guiding principle that I'm missing at least by reading this proposal of regulation is look at every stage who has more incentives to innovate, because that's what's driving the game. That's what's the missing opportunity very clearly if we want to intervene in this type of markets.
Thank you, Juan. So this is very interesting, and then it also leads to the next speaker quite straightly, because it has, Thomas has been writing on data and governance, and so all about, structuring and shaping the incentives for others in the ecosystem to innovate. So Thomas, recently you've been looking actually at the power asymmetry between the platforms and the complementors, and how actually complementors react to that.
Yes, thanks a lot, Carmelo and Joanna. It's wonderful to be here and to share this panel with the other speakers. So as Carmelo said, I would like to talk about ecosystem governance and value creation. And I would like to share some ideas, or some insights from our recent work together with my colleagues Thomas Huber and Julien Malauran. So there's two ideas that I would like to share with you, and that actually fit quite nicely in what has been discussed before by Frédéric and Michael, who have discussed this complexity of ecosystems, which makes it difficult to regulate and to come up with regulatory frameworks, but also to what Alex and Juan mentioned, and this focus on complementary innovation. So the two ideas that I would like to share with you is first, that while it seems that we often talk about value creation as a separate concern in addition to competition, what we've seen, if we take a complementary perspective, this can actually not really be separated and should be considered together. And the second element is that I would like to add collective initiatives by complementers as an element that we might wish to consider more explicitly in our discussions and also in our frameworks, something that we may not have done so far. So regarding the first point, it's almost as if there were two camps, right? One that focuses on competition and contestability, and the other one that focuses and stresses value creation. And so while the first, both of course are very, very important and insightful, but we sometimes discuss in the competition view, or we debate whether or not markets are contestable and whether or not competitive behavior by powerful actors is fair. This value creation view much more stresses that platforms provide the foundation for others to innovate by providing access to resources, and this is the discussion around ecosystem governance. And because of this foundation to innovate, the conclusion is sometimes that we should be careful not to over-regulate, because it may in fact harm innovation. And when we take the complementers perspective, which is what we are often concerned with and interested in, when we discuss regulatory issues and frameworks, these two views can actually not be really separated. So what we see in our case studies is that over time, complementers are exposed to these two forces simultaneously. On the one hand, so they need to find a way to carefully balance leveraging resource access on the one hand and handling competitive threats on the other hand. And over time, what happens then is that complementers are exposed to various platform owner moves that change one or both of these dimensions. So many of these moves may be, this platform owner moves may be beneficial, as they may increase resource access, or they may reduce competition in a specific niche. But other moves may be harmful for some complementers and for all, even for all complementers. And so what we see is that complementers are able, they can respond to these moves, right? They are not necessarily fully powerless or dependent. They may be architects of their own fate to some extent, but especially if these moves negatively affect a large majority or all complementers, then this may be something that we particularly may wish to consider in our discussion on regulation. So coming to the second point that I wanted to put up for discussion here is something that we increasingly see is that if these platform owner moves negatively affect complementers, we see that complementers actually voice their concerns increasingly in a collective way, and sometimes even organize to join forces toward like the platform owner. And we see this on the one hand for individuals. So when you think of gig economy platforms, when you think of Uber or delivery, depending on the country, we see that participants would actually form or join unions, right? So they would organize at this individual level. But, and that's interesting, I think, we also see this at the organizational level. So when we think of like app developers, we see organizations like the Coalition for App Fairness, and in France we see an initiative called France Digital, which is collectives of app developers that join forces. And we see something similar in enterprise software platforms, for example, where we have partner associations whose goal is to collectively influence the platform owner. And I think, and this is what I would like to put up for discussion, this seems to be an element that has not received that much attention so far, and it may actually help us address some of these issues around ecosystems being increasingly complex, because if there is, so we seem to focus a lot on this asymmetry between large, powerful platform owners, the gatekeepers, and we discuss what gatekeepers are, or which company is a gatekeeper or not, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the small, seemingly powerless, dependent complementers. And this seems to overlook that there's actually often many complementers, and they may join forces and engage in collective action, and that this may balance power, at least to some extent. So we may want to, instead of focusing exclusively on prescribing what platform owners are allowed to do or are not allowed to do, we may also look at these collectives as a counterbalance to powerful platform owners. And this may mean, for example, that in our regulations, we may wish to consider that it's that to prevent platform owners from hindering these collectives to form, or even maybe punishing membership or leading roles in these initiatives. So this is an element that may not have received attention so far. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, Thomas, also because I think that, this is an issue of that points more to self-regulations or some of the dynamics that might take place as a response within the ecosystem that might counterbalance this. And I think that, in the second panel, so Michael will speak probably also on this issue. So this is a returning point. And as usually time flies when we are here, all these interesting points and debates. And I think that we need to move forward now. We go back to our second keynote speaker. Doesn't need introduction. Marshall von Alstyne, professor of information system at Boston University, author of many influential articles and books on the subject we're discussing today. And he will share some notes on what is good and what is bad ways of regulating platforms in this digital space. Marshall, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks. So what I want to give is a little bit of a presentation of what I think is working and what's not working. I also want to give structural reasons as to why I think things are truly different and what that structure implies, and then give, in the end, 3 solutions what I think some of these problems are. So to highlight some of the things that I think folks are already familiar with, I like using this particular example, Amazon calling safe on one of its players wiping out a competitor because it's a judge, jury, and executioner in its own marketplace. And we look at Amazon using merchant data to enter the merchant markets, or Google using advertiser data to bid against third parties. So they have an informational advantage. And without going into the details of this, we're seeing this across the board. So we're seeing concerns in Europe, we're seeing it in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, and fascinatingly, it hasn't been mentioned much today, but also in China. They're also intervening heavily in the platforms. For reference, we're seeing legislation, even in just the last term, introduced by a large number of different congressmen to reduce the switching costs, to reduce the discriminatory contact, or remove the conflicts of interest. One that's particularly interesting, but perhaps damaging, is just outright banning the entry of platforms into adjacent marketplaces. Is this a good idea or is this a bad idea? And why would that be the case? I want to summarize some of the thinking. So we have before us some existing legislation. So if we look at the Digital Markets Act, and we look across the newly proposed legislation in the United States, some of the things I think are quite good. Eliminating the most favored nation clause so you can get competition off platform. Increasing advertising transparency, fair uninstall of apps. I must say there's some apps that come native on the iPhone I really would like to swap out. Google Maps is much better. Friend access, interoperability of data. Also really interesting is that merchants are disintermediated from their own customer data. So I think those are all things that do need to be fixed. Take a look at some things I think aren't working well based on the structure. One is forbidding the combination of data sources without explicit opt-in. This would reduce the ability to create network effects. Another one is the ability of platforms to enter their merchants' markets. In any other market, we welcome competition because that's actually good for consumers. Here, it's perhaps the unfairness. So can we get the best of both? Can we get the competition, but also the fairness? I'm also going to highlight a couple of issues about data portability that I think we can actually handle much better. The idea is to create competition, but I think we can not only create the competition, but we can also create the wealth. Then I think we can do a better job with mergers and market entry as well. At its core, I want to start with a somewhat different question. So I believe that what competition authorities are currently asking is this issue, and I've heard this directly quoted, how do we create competition, fair contestable markets, and restore user business control over data that affects them? When I think the question really needs to be somewhat different, how do we create value and foster innovation and divide that fairly? One of the chief issues is, again, this difference between rival versus non-rival resources. In traditional antitrust in old markets for steel and oil and dollars or autos, those are rival resources, so carving them up and creating competition works to create value. But for a non-rival resource, splitting it up means you're going to reduce the network effects in this case. I'm going to go back into some of the structural changes here. I think pretty much everyone's mentioned that the GAFAM had network effects. So whether it's one person search making another better, or product recommendations making better matches, social networks or two-sided markets, all of these manage network effects. What's interesting is that this is an externality. Externalities are going to need to be managed in the marketplaces, and they're non-rival. Again, if we carve them up, they get smaller. We're going to spread them over fewer folks. That actually destroys resources or destroys value. So I think what we need to do is to manage the structures that do create that value. So let's go back and examine the structures. So I think one of the things that's missed in the current competition law or an antitrust is that the structure has changed. We can use some really, really deep economics to show what's actually happening. So if we look at 2 Nobel Prizes given originally on transactions cost economics, these are described the nature of markets and the nature of firms. What was the insight? The insight that came out of this, and this again was the original antitrust logic, transactions costs are the sum of the search, coordination, negotiation, information asymmetry costs. If the total costs of production and transactions cost is lower inside the firm, then you make the good, else you buy the good. And that effectively decides the boundary between the vertically integrated firm and the marketplace. And often what we're doing in antitrust authorities is to then divide up these assets, especially as transactions costs are lowering. So you want to create more competition. So you divide it up and you have more market-based interactions. In more recent versions of the same thing, by the way, this also goes to the own versus rent decision as opposed to just the make versus buy decision. And this could explain some of the attributes of Airbnb and Uber and others. But there's a second set of ideas that's missed in this basic story between markets and hierarchies. That's externalities. So Coase won the second aspect of his Nobel Prize, is again for the management of externalities. And the original insight there was interfering radio spectrum. And you need to internalize those, or can you actually put those into the marketplace in one way or another? Well, so we've just observed all of the platform firms deal in externalities, they deal in spillovers. What's fascinating about this is individual externalities are too small to trade in the marketplace. So if your Google search makes my Google search better, we can't trade that in the marketplace. Or one person's Amazon recommendation makes another Amazon's purchase better and improve those experiences. These externalities are too small for you and I to buy and sell. What that means is that we need a different structure that internalizes them to make them better. That's the platform. That's neither market nor hierarchy. That's the intuition. So together with Jeff Parker, we actually tried to prove this formally. So this was actually a line of research in management science. It's actually quite great to see the idea. So imagine developers could, the thing is between data and code. Imagine developers could build on each other's code or they could sell it. Now, everyone would like to build on everyone else's code. That's a positive externality to make their own code more efficient, but they also want to sell. If you sell it, then you can't build on it because it's private. So you actually reduce the amount of spillover that you get. What we find is that orchestration, where somebody internalizes the spillover and then makes that information valuable to all of them, actually improves the marketplace. And what winds up happening is that orchestration dominates both vertical production and market-based production. It's a different form of organization that suggests by internalizing the spillovers, you can actually create an intellectual property rights regime where you create an economy that actually creates more value. So that's the theory, but we have tons of evidence to support it. Let me give you a couple of great stories that you'll all be familiar with. So take Napster. This was a free marketplace for songs. I have to give Munger, credit for pointing out this observation. Apple then comes in and it then does the orchestration, and we don't even think about Napster anymore. Now you use Apple or Spotify or another service, and they've taken the transactions cost out and done such a good job of quality control that even that one-to-one peer-to-peer market exchange is now dominated by a nexus, which is a platform in there. And in fact, they've actually managed it. Or if we take a look at what happened in the marketplace of Austin when Uber and Lyft left. What happened there is that Austin was going to require certain regulation in terms of certification, and Uber and Lyft temporarily left the city. So what happened? You might think then that the coordinated market would be more efficient. That's not what actually happened. A bunch of drivers lost their jobs, but then everyone re-coordinated on Facebook where riders would post their location, drivers would respond in the comment field, They negotiate price and you pay with Cash, Square, or PayPal. What was interesting is then the individuals, not the platform, would bear the risk of whether or not the other party is a felon or throws up in the car. Dispatch was not necessarily based on proximity. Volume fell dramatically. Interestingly enough, because there's no 30% cut or 20% cut to the driver's share goes up and folks are willing to tip generously. So drivers in that sense benefited, but the total volume of transactions fell dramatically. And DWI arrests went up 7.5%. So imagine each driver setting their own prices in negotiation. That in effect has created more competition, but it's not necessarily more efficient than the platform orchestration. The point is platform orchestration can internalize those externalities and be more efficient than pure markets themselves, which is often what the competition authorities are pushing towards and break up with the division of assets. So what's to be done? So I agree, there are some real problems that we do need to address. So how would we do this? Let me give you 3 ideas. All right, so idea number 1. All right, so 3 solutions. The first solution is to create fair access to the same infrastructure and data so that we get the same levels of competition. Suppose that what we do is you create a fair legal and technical firewall, easily handled with APIs and with Chinese walls and infrastructure. What this does is it separates the apps on the top from the infrastructure on the bottom. Platforms then require, so that's the separation that takes place. Platforms are then required to publicly post the terms of access. In terms of what's it going to take for the access to the data, access to the infrastructure, and everybody gains access to the same infrastructure and the same data at the same time. That is the internal native apps and the third-party infrastructure apps. What this does is it then shares that infrastructure and data resource. So third parties gain access to that same data that the platform has at the same time. There's now efficient competitive entry, and we've covered the cost of infrastructure. So Amazon entering a market is like Google entering on top of Amazon's market, or a small startup entering. So we get the benefits of entry, but there's also fairness. There's no unfairness in terms of access to that data. So that's recommendation number 1. Recommendation number 2 is to look at some of the merger control. So I get it in terms of banning. Consider the example of Pinduoduo. So Alibaba tries to buy Pinduoduo, and so these are again 2 e-commerce marketplaces. This is in China. If this happens, that's dangerous, of course, because Alibaba absorbing that more powerful if that's true. But consider what happens if we ban that outright. Simply the large platforms can't do it. Tencent didn't have its own e-commerce marketplace. If Tencent actually works with Pinduoduo, now this small organization is less likely to be crushed by Alibaba because now it can tap the network that Tencent has in WeChat, and it gets financial resources. So it gets much more competitive relative to Alibaba than it is when it's not attached to another adjacent platform. Again, the issue here is that Tencent wasn't particularly an active player in the e-commerce marketplace, even though it was very active in the social. So we have to look at which markets overlap and don't. So the solution here is to look at the counterfactuals to determine which other configurations might add value. And a different partner could add more competition and, again, more network effects, which then creates the value. So again, the outright ban seems like a foolish idea. We're looking at some of these other configurations might be ways of creating considerable wealth and competition. Let's consider data portability again as this method of creating value for users and competition. I argue that data portability, as currently conceived, has a number of different flaws. One of the most important is that removing data from its location takes away context. There was a great study done by Programmable where they downloaded Facebook data, but it loses everyone's posts. So if someone responds to your data, you respond to theirs, that's their data. So you don't get that. That's not part of the port. So it loses context. Ports are at a moment in time, so they decay, and it's depreciating stock of information. Another critical element is impotence. Once it's removed from the infrastructure, You can't share a benefit with friends. You can't receive them. You can't make a purchase. You couldn't get a coupon based on that data in the infrastructure. So it's not as potent if you take it away. And the last one I think is significantly underappreciated. Yes, I understand the argument about taking the store ratings off of Amazon so you can actually create more competition someplace else. But then stores can selectively drop their unflattering reviews, which creates consumer risk. So you've got moral hazard problems. I'd like to propose a different regime, which is an in situ access. The idea is to bring the algorithm to the data as distinct from the data to the algorithm. And it's all through user or merchant position, which addresses each of those problems. First, complete context is preserved. So others' posts are there, your posts and third-party contact all remains intact. It's fresh, it's always current, so you get to see whatever is there and update it. Privacy is actually dramatically enhanced. If somebody's behaved badly and you want to turn off access, you just close the APIs. You're guaranteed they don't have to destroy the data because they never had it. They took the algorithm to the data and you're protected. It retains its potency. Data in situ is actionable. Benefit can be shared or received according to the existing infrastructure. And it's low hazard. You can't selectively edit unflattering reviews as a merchant. And so you reduce the risk of transactions taking place on the platform. There's even one further benefit of this that I think is dramatically underappreciated of the in situ access. Many of you may have followed it in the news recently that Facebook shut down access of German and New York University researchers to Facebook, and they had been granted access by users. So they'd be able to install an app to actually see what ads people were saying, what misinformation was going. And Facebook terminated that access. They even got a scolding from the FTC. What's interesting is that only Facebook knows the extent of its misinformation problem. They're not even sharing with the White House. If users had in situ data rights, you could grant that NYU or German access or anyone that you chose. We could then learn, have platforms influenced elections or reduced vaccinations, aided insurrection or abetted balkanization. What this does is it gives a mechanism for oversight on the data where it's resident, right? It enables benchmarking, price comparison oversight that the platforms have actively sought to avoid. So we think this in situ data right is far more powerful in giving, in creating competition and also enabling oversight. So I think this is a way to actually deal with it. At its heart, I'm simply making, on these three recommendations, one basic observation. The issue is creating value and dividing it fairly, not creating competition and dividing it badly. So I think we need to, and the reason at its heart is externalities need to be internalized in a way that create value. Information and these network effects are non-rival resources, so we should share them as opposed to carve them up. And I think that's the main insight by which we should be operating on these different recommendations. So for those of you that are interested, we have a new article forthcoming on in situ data rights. It's coming out in the next couple of months. And I think as Michael Jacobides mentioned, we have some work on platform bidders and antitrust and some commentary on several of these things. If you're interested in the proof that the structure, the platforms beat vertical integration or markets, and there's the management science paper, Innovation, Openness, and Platform Control. And of course, there's an older paper on platform envelopment about how platforms move into adjacent markets, perhaps even with some inferior technologies. All these things I think are relevant to the case of antitrust. So with that, let me stop and Carmelo, see if there happen to be any questions.
Thank you, Masha. Thank you very much. And I think we're going to engage with actually these 3 points that you gave us, particularly on the data, but also on the counterfactual. So what are the other configurations to solve some of these issues with the next panel? Starting with Michael Cusumano, who is with us today. So thank you very much for flying all the way from Boston to join us here in Copenhagen. Please join us and here. You have the clicker. All right, great. So, and Yeah, so Marshall mentioned, right, so other configurations, and one of which could actually be, do we really need, again, right? I mean, regulations, or can actually self-regulation be one of such configuration, which connects also to a point that Thomas made in the previous panel. So I give the floor to you, Michael.
Thank you, Carmelo, and it's great to be here. So I have prepared some remarks based on the paper that Michael Jacobides referred to in the special issue. And also, I talked about this last summer in the Boston University Strategy Conference. So I think it does fit into what we are talking about here. Now, just always have to plug the latest book, but actually the self-regulation topic we brought up in a chapter on double-edged swords in the 2019 book. So we explored some of these issues, but really felt that we had to get deeper into them. And again, this was the book with Annabelle Gower and David Yaffe. So we've just been building on this and extending it. So one idea that we had is that what we're facing, particularly in social media, but potentially with other platform areas, is what you might say a moral hazard and possible extension to a new type of tragedy of the commons. So in the United States, at least, we had this 1996 law, which is often referred to, Section 230, which essentially says that platforms cannot be held responsible for the information they disseminate. They are the intermediaries, essentially. They're not publishers. You can also extend this to goods that are disseminated from a marketplace, but primarily this law refers to content. It fueled growth of a lot of these platforms, in particular social media. But our argument is that two things: the lack of specific consequences, particularly in the United States. I think the Europeans are ahead of us. The lack of consequences for disseminating misinformation or disinformation, particularly recently dangerous information about health, for example, but before that, election information, leading to Trump's election, really has done damage, and in many ways, it's also destroying user trust in the internet and what is reliable or not. And we can think of the internet as a common resource for information exchange as well as e-commerce. And so there's this moral hazard and potential tragedy for all common users going on. For example, in social media, this is just a recent analysis, 80% of Facebook users expect the content to be false and deceptive. So something has gone wrong. We don't really have regulation of social media properties in the United States. And again, certainly the Chinese are way ahead of everybody on this, but they regulate everything that has to do with content. But historically, whenever there's a new technology that comes out, they're usually complicated, evolving quickly. The government does not have experts in the technology to the same extent as the companies. And of course, there's a lot of moving targets. And so it's very difficult in general to regulate new technologies such as we have seen with the internet. So an alternative has really been self-regulation by companies under specific conditions. So that was the idea of this paper, to look at when does self-regulation appear to be more effective than times when it is not. So we looked at a few cases. These were not scientifically selected, but just from general knowledge and reading about self-regulation as a topic. So cinema and video games have created industry associations and codes to classify content. There was a lot of pressure on companies to restrict advertisements on tobacco and alcohol for radio and television. This was before the internet, and also self-preferencing in airline reservations when these computerized systems were first created around 1960, led initially by American Airlines with the Sabre system. So they were putting their own flights first. There were lawsuits by competitors and some government attempts to intervene, but largely in these cases, firms decided to stop doing these bad behaviors when there was sufficient pressure on them to act, as well as I guess, an analysis that the impact would not be so great on their cost of doing business, of course. So we created this matrix here, and then I'll just give a few more comments on it. So for example, we think there's a zone when we're likely to see more self-regulation. And by the way, you can attach business costs to what's impacted through a number of elements that are specific to platforms and ecosystems, such as network effects. If they're going to take a measure that would greatly decrease or decrease network effects, firms would see that as a high cost of doing business, and they might not do it. And again, in some of these cases, we don't really see network effects. I think Marshall had a comment on that, but in other cases we do. So in any case, where there are relatively low costs, but a high probability of government intervention, we're likely to see firms being more proactive in self-regulation. And then there are other cases where it's a very high cost of business, and we expect firms to fight back in those cases, like self-referencing or bundling, some other cases of labor laws, like in the gig economy. And we do see these companies fighting. But we have other cases where self-regulation is occurring. So let me just end this with some specific insights from the comparisons. And again, we can debate some of these. So this idea of a moral hazard driving a potential tragedy where the internet gets damaged, it's not clear if platform CEOs see this and are willing to act on it. So that's one issue. We're not likely to see self-regulation if the short-term costs are too high. And again, this could be tied to network effects and other specific economics of platforms. We do need credible threats of government and intervention, we think, based on history. So everything that governments are doing in Europe, and China, and the United States would seem to be pushing these companies to self-regulate. The other idea that we get from looking at history is coalitions of firms and codes of conduct that they can agree on may very well be more effective than expecting individual firms to act. And again, we've seen this in the movie industry, video games, tobacco and alcohol ads, or bans on terrorist content, and also child abuse ads. There's another idea that regulation or self-regulation can impact platform sides differently. It may actually create opportunities for new businesses or new demand, like family-oriented content or safe social media or something of that sort. So that's an interesting thing for managers and entrepreneurs to think about. The other problem that we see, I'm not sure how to relate this in, is there's a lot of talk about any self-regulation in social media that would violate free speech. That's attracting a lot of resistance from companies and from outsiders. Companies say they're going to be using more human editors and more artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to solve the problem, but this may very well be an area where we need help from regulatory agencies and more specific guidelines. So that does possibly get back to Section 230 revisions. Anyway, the prediction that we made is that the problems over Section 230 and all of these discussions, they've led to attacks on particularly social media and Section 230 protections from both right-wing and left-wing folks. The right-wing saying they're already being censored, so the social media firms should be treated as publishers and should not have any protections. And left-wing folks saying they're not editing enough. So no matter how you look at it, the bottom line seems to be there will be a lot of pressure, at least we predicted, on platform CEOs to introduce more effective self-regulation measures. So I think we do see that happening already.
I would like to ask something. Thank you so much for your presentation, but I find this idea very fascinating, and I wonder whether self-regulation is a sustainable solution or whether it's a short-term solution that needs to be followed up by some policy, some regulation, and whether it can be the basis for such regulations, or whether instead of having a top-down approach, we have a bottom-up approach where we actually see what is the problem that the participants are trying to self-regulate and then develop the policy.
Right. So So bottom up is self-regulation, I
Yeah.
assume. Yeah, so we've, again, seen this in other industries. The movie industry started doing self-regulation 100 years ago, and that has persisted. So I think it's better than just pure top-down attempts. And as we've heard from the other talks, there's so many obstacles to regulating these digital markets, and what is the market and what is the ecosystem and that. And the firms are the experts, and they know what they're trying to do. But if we can convince them that if they keep doing what they're doing without any restraints, they're going to damage the environment for everyone, right? That is the tragedy of the commons, right? People putting their self-interest ahead of the common good, cutting down the last tree on Easter Island. You make a fire the last night, someone can cook a meal, but then there's no trees left for the rest of the community. So that's the argument we're trying to make and trying to push that mentality. But that is very much bottom up, and that kind of work or belief and work with regulatory agencies could lead to more sustainable regulation, but it is going to be a moving target. Things are going to change. Things are very different now in social media than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and who will end up competing with whom. And I think Frédéric's comments earlier that you can't regulate potential competitors. They have to be in a market already be competing, and that is the problem. I think that we don't.
Is that another reason for not pushing for this self-regulation? Because that's the fact that you can't predict what it's going to be, but exactly that's part of the intentions at the regulations, right? I mean, fixing things ex ante. But what you say, I mean, how can you do that if you don't know where the technology is going to take you?
Well, I think a lot of these entrepreneurs know where the technology can go.
Exactly.
So I lived through and wrote about an example with Microsoft and Bill Gates. So the Department of Justice pressure on Microsoft in the 1990s, beginning with a potential acquisition of Intuit in 1994, which actually made and was reversed. That put a lot of pressure on Microsoft, and then the antitrust trial to break them up. So Microsoft became a different company after the 1990s, and you could argue they weren't into social media, et cetera, but in effect they were. They had tried to be with the MSN. So they self-regulated quite a bit after that trial, and it hurt them in many ways. They didn't go aggressively into the mobile space or cloud computing, and they allowed other competitors to come in. So that attempt of pressure from the government and then translating into some self-regulation actually was probably good for entrepreneurship in the internet. Of course, we created other new monsters, Google and Apple, had a resurgence, and Amazon, but at least it spread it out. Microsoft did not end up dominating the world, which many people thought would happen in the 1990s.
One would say that we have new competitors, not necessarily new monsters either. I mean, so it's better to have alternatives rather just one
So the pressure on Microsoft was essential, and there was also a lot of pressure put on Intel and a few other firms, Cisco.
More persuasion, in a sense. Terrific, thank you. And on this point, I will actually ask Tobias to jump in on yet another configuration, if you will. So Tobias, what can we learn, in fact, from other ways of regulating, network industries, such as from the network of utilities, if that can be exported in a way to the digital space and the multi-sidedness, aspect of platforms, or whether that is not an effective approach to follow.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carmelo. I was just informed that my internet connection is unstable. So if I'm not there, let's blame it on the Hotel Sant Cugat in Barcelona somewhere. But there we go. I'll give it a try.
I don't see the.
Yeah. So yeah, I think Michael's talk was very interesting, especially when you started out saying that there might actually be some sort of information deficit, let's say, on the part of the policymakers, and that one way to solve that, or one way to address this, is to rely on self-governance or self-regulation. Now, I think especially what had happened in Europe, especially in the kind of the first instances of thinking about how to regulate, was relying on the past, on how to regulate platforms. And you could see that a lot of the proposals, a lot of the ideas that came up at the very beginning actually were to a large extent inspired by utilities regulation, right? And I think, in a way, I'm sort of doing I'm talking double history here, because I'm talking about the beginning of the discussion in Europe, which was taking elements from even before the beginning of the discussion in Europe as a discussion point. But let me try and share my screen and just talk about this a bit. So what is good regulation? What is it that we can learn from utilities? Now, if we just think about digital platforms, and clearly I'm preaching to the converted here, but just some basic economics, they're an important part of the infrastructure of online activities. And no one pretends today that you can get by without online activities, just as some years ago you wouldn't pretend to be able to act without electricity, without water, and so on. So it's really become an essential service. In terms of the cost structure, many of these platforms, or most of these platforms, will typically have zero marginal costs and some positive fixed cost of setting it up. These infrastructure costs might be higher or lower, but for sure, they do make up the much more important part of cost compared to marginal or variable cost. And this is also something that kind of came in at the tail end of Michael's presentation. Of course, they often occupy dominant positions for their respective functions, right? So Google has still a very firm grip on the search market and so on. That really sounds like utilities, right? It really sounds like utilities, and it makes a lot of sense to just assume that these early proposals by policymakers did rely very heavily on utilities regulation. So questions like interconnectivity, unbundling, these all were concepts and constructs that really came from some past regulation efforts on different kinds of utilities. Now, what made this tendency even stronger is that, of course, many of these policies were very successful, right? If we think about this in terms of market efficiency, especially let's think of the one market that's probably closest to digital platforms, telecoms, right? Prices declined. There was competition in several parts of the market. So the idea was clearly that you need to grant access to the infrastructure at a certain price. So most competition commissions and regulators were thinking a lot about access prices. Consumers all of a sudden had different options to choose from. And especially in telecoms, there was a clear set of rules or a clear set of features of a market to identify significant market power, right? So this all sounded like a remarkably successful set of efforts of utilities regulation, and therefore it seemed very intuitive to use this as a blueprint for a prima facie similar industry or service. So, but how comparable really, if we look a bit closer, really are these industries? So for time reasons, I'm not going to talk too much about the business model of utilities, but basically services were fairly homogeneous. There was very little entry. It was, of course, very much infrastructure based, and most of the services were, in a way, sort of stable. Most investment was into replacement investments rather than innovative investments. So there wasn't a lot of improvements going on especially in the early stages when markets were supposed to become more competitive. And I think this is where platforms really start looking very different. when we think about innovation, when we think about any platform, I would argue that a platform creates incentives for innovation, and not just by the single utilities, the utilities operator, right? It's not Deutsche Telekom when they used to be the fixed line monopolists that were the main drivers of innovation, or the four mobile operators. On platforms, incentives or innovation comes both from users, from complementers, on top of the own innovations by the platform, right? So if we think about platform, or if we think about innovation as a relevant measure or relevant output for the efficiency of a market, then we really need to look at the level of innovation at the ecosystem rather than just the firm level, right? We shouldn't be looking at Google or Facebook's level of innovation. We should be looking at the Facebook ecosystems or Google's ecosystems level of innovation. On top of that, of course, many of the innovation cycles are significantly shorter than they would be in utilities. So that's just a different way of saying this. If we look at different forms of platform innovation, the status quo of a platform, you can think of value being created by three aspects here. The technological product value, right? That's what the platform provides. That's the technical functionality that it provides. You've got user created value, and you've got complementary value. So if the platform were to innovate, and if the platform were the only agent to innovate, still, of course, the value would go up, the value of the overall platform would go up. But what really gives you that additional boost is the ecosystem innovation, the level of innovation that happens at the ecosystem level. In other words, users and complementers that provide their own value to the system. So therefore, some of the policies that worked a treat in utilities may actually affect the incentives to innovate by platforms and on platforms in sort of non-trivial ways. So I just picked out an example here, but I'm sure we will find many others. So unbundling would probably be translated in the platform world as trying to separate as much as possible the platform level and the complementary level, meaning that you cannot self-preference your own products or your own complements on your own platform. You might be asked to share data with complementers, so they are in the same position as your own complementers, and so on. So as I said, this was considered fairly successful in the telecoms industry. Now, did this work, or could this work in the digital platform space? Well, first of all, it could affect platform incentives to improve the infrastructure itself. Clearly, if I don't get any of the complementary value, if I cannot appropriate any of the complementary value, that will have an effect on me. It could reduce the quality of the match between the platform and the complements that are produced by the first party. And thirdly, the complementers may become more similar, especially when it comes to data sharing, because they all use the same data, right? So a lot of the innovation that happens on platforms is really seeking out and finding innovative ways of interacting with data, with user data, with consumer data. And using that in innovative ways. If you give someone the same bunch of data, because that's the one that the platform has provided, then that might actually reduce some of the variety that's actually so important on platforms. So what I would argue here is that policies that were aimed and worked really well at the static efficiency of an existing and incumbent utilities provider need to be assessed for their dynamic effect. And so some of these regulations that have been proposed, and I think the discussion has in many ways evolved and has started putting more nuances on these, but if utilities regulation really does capture the dynamic part or the dynamic aspect of digital platforms. And secondly, also the ecosystem part, namely that a lot of innovation really does take place outside the platform operator itself. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tobias. In the interest of time and reconnecting with the discussion, I think that you offer points that connect very well in terms also, particularly on the data, which not surprisingly is appearing, in many of the interventions here. And speaking of data, I would like to call Cristina on stage, our only, unfortunately, representation of the female world, but nonetheless an important one. So Cristina, one of the points on particularly on Marsha's interventions was, this idea of in situ data rights, so that is a way to free up value creation opportunities while also accounting for the distribution part. Tobias was also mentioning though that some of the things that might happen when there's more standardization of the platforms is that you lower that sort of differentiation on the data side. So how should we think about this? And with this proposal of creating this sort of or unbundling this sort of data silos and then making data more freely available. Is that the right approach?
Yes, thank you, Carmelo. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to take part to such interesting discussion. I've heard many things, and I will touch upon these two issues just raised. However, let me do a very short introduction, because there were also some other mention about data, few, but some nonetheless. So perhaps also because we want to talk about principle of regulation, I do a little bit of a step backwards, and I kind of frame what I think are the most daunting and also the most interesting aspects of regulation related to data, and why we should sort of attention them, or why we should try to frame them differently. And then I will touch upon both in situ or opening or closing of data, and also a little bit the innovation that relates to data and why. So what I see personally, I think it's a lot of, it's a set of wrong assumptions a little bit on what data are and the kind of relationship they have with innovation, and therefore with some of the most important things, discussed in this attempt to regulating platform, namely, of course, competition and innovation. This relationship is much more complex than somehow has been framed so far, in the sense that it's not, of course, simple and is not direct in any way. And that's why sometimes we fail to address like single data operation and to connect them with a specific result. For instance, more data do not always lead to more innovation, like to better prediction, or to more refined AI solution, and therefore to better services. I have in mind the case of Netflix. They have been able to innovate also because they changed completely their approach to data. They had enough data, but that was not enough to provide recommendation to user. They had to change completely their approach to data and frame it in a qualitatively different way. A second point, aggregation is not a bad practice. On the contrary, it's very often the basis of constructing innovation with data. Without aggregation of data and without aggregation of different sources of data, it's very difficult to build, innovation and learning. A third point, access is not always good or better, is not always enough to promote innovation and competition. Many of the most interesting aspects of AI development that we see today, they are there because they have access to publicly available data set, or they are moving toward using less data and developing, alternative solutions. So even these cannot be taken for granted and needs to be a little bit explored in its meaning. So what are then these two kind of, I think, wrong assumption that pervade or invade a little bit the discussion about regulation. I think the first is that sometimes data are thought as being sector-specific resources. So there is a little bit, and we may, if we pay a little bit attention to it, we may gather it. Sometimes we talk about digital economy as a specific sector of the economy. So like that needs to be regulated in some way. But of course, this is also captured a little bit, I think, by the ambiguity of the DMA, which it sits between this sector-specific and more general piece of regulation. But I think this distinction is becoming less and less tenable. And particularly if we want to talk about innovation and data innovation, it's under the eyes of everyone. We cannot talk any longer of a digital sector, but we need to frame the whole economy as a matter also of link to data and the specificity of this link, of course. Now, the second assumption, and this is happened at the same time, is that data are linked to some sort of generic notion, of course, of innovation, as if they were these sort of floating entities that are able to float around or to be accessed or to be ported with no consequences, as if they were floating in a void, without an embedment in particular organizational structure, in particular infrastructure or technological infrastructure, but also, if you want, cultural infrastructure, because yes, of course, this counts to procure value out of data. So we have done some, in a recent published paper that we have with co-author Alexi Elton and Yannis Kalinikos, which is published on the Journal of Management Information System, we actually describe data analytics and not just data as an embedded process. So even algorithms, they are embedded into organizational reality. They have some very forceful links with decision-making, organizational culture, and many other things that we should, I think, take into account if we want to understand a little bit more the condition of data production, circulation, and use, and of course, how do they link to a value and to innovation. So I think that if we want to although this persists a little bit, right? This, of course, data are resources. Marshall pointed out, and he, of course, mentioned that the kind of the resources they are. We know that they are particular resources. But however, we need also to complement this view with this condition of data production, circulation, and use, how they are embedded in specific kind of reality. And if we don't do, I think we do a big disservice to, the economy, not the digital economy, but the economy that is becoming increasingly digital. Because if we discuss otherwise this operation, like interoperability or portability, or opening or closing a little bit the access to the resources without considering these other aspects, I think we go somewhere, but we don't cover the whole ground, the whole innovation, or the whole possibility that data instead give to us. If I have another minute, I would like to just sort of build up on the kind of alternative way in which we can look at data. I see a nodding, so I go on, right? Another minute.
One German minute, not Italian minute.
Okay, German minute, which I know very, very well, right? Being German, as you know. But yes. So one point about how can we look at the kind of innovation data enable and why that could be important. I have covered this point also in other discussion, and there is a paper out which is about ecosystem and data, which I think may be of interest to others here. So data have a mediating properties, mediating capabilities. And to these mediating capabilities very much link the notion of innovation, the data trigger, the data procure. What are these mediating properties and why are they important? Mediating property means that once you relate data with processes or things, they change profoundly that process and then things. So if you think about ecosystem innovation and you think about a process such as the relationship between complementors and platform, and you datify it, because of course this process, this interaction goes on and evolves through data, is mediated via data, then you understand that data concur in changing and innovating this relationship in a very much dynamic way that needs to be attention if we want to understand what kind of innovation these, digital ecosystem innovation trigger. So to close, and that's what I wanted to say, then of course, let's regulate, but let's avoid gross simplification of treating data still as resources. Let's focus on the way they produce value and they foster innovation in the whole economy, not the digital economy as taking as separated from other aspects of the economy. And yes, I hope this will contribute further to the discussion on principle of good regulation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Cristina, also for the German minute. On this, I will, you open up basically to the idea of what are the sort of efficiencies, so if we were to use a language that is dear to the regulators and economists, and the space that we need to care and then, also cater to in terms of regulation. And so I will call Danny, our last speaker on the panel, to consider this, right? And then particularly one point that also Marshall makes, in their paper, the special issues on merger and acquisitions, is that, for instance, one of the hotly debated aspect is that one of the motivations for firms to acquire some of the other smaller firms is actually to get more access to this data, and then yes, create value, but drive most of that value towards themselves. But you have written about that we need to account for other efficiencies rather than just the reductions of competitive threat for this. So the floor is yours, and you're better entitled to explain this.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief so that we still have some time for question. So in the chat, Michael Jacobides also said, why is it that we are limited to just welfare calculation in the United States? And he takes a more nuanced view. But overall, when we hear this, for example, in the United States, we have to look at things like employment. We need to look at things like diversity and inclusion. Normally it tends to be in a very negative way, that somehow we're not looking at it and there are only negative effects. I'd say quite the opposite, that if we're to take Michael's nuance seriously, we need to be thinking also about the value creation of platforms. So think particularly about SMEs, and in certain countries, MSMEs, and their ability to get onto platforms and to be part of a global e-commerce ecosystem. So some small producer making handcraft goods in some rural jurisdiction being able to match up with customers in somewhere else in the world, for example. The ability, what we've seen, I think, as a result of the pandemic is simply lots of opportunities for small businesses to really survive and in some cases thrive in ways we hadn't really conceptualized before, and certainly are not really looking at enough empirically. We get a handful of stories, and that's a nice start, but this is in part a call to action of we need to do some more research into this area. So part of it is IO and the competition authorities have been thinking about these capabilities really in a traditional lens, and maybe this is where either some resource-based view or knowledge-based view would help in terms of understanding the value creation part of platforms. So again, we tend to hear so much about the value destroying, but not enough about the value creation. So we might think, for example, for impact on the venture capital market, what it means to have serial startups, and why it is that if we look beyond the particular deal, so we're told, for example, think about creeping acquisitions, but we don't get the other side of it, which is founders are more likely after selling to start new companies, and in fact, create little innovation hubs so it gets to a whole related management literature that hasn't been connected to the platform debate about amalgamation effects of entrepreneurship clusters in certain localities. What we're hearing too much about is, say, the aspect of competition where, maybe there's more, to Fred's point, horizontal threat than before, that we're not really sort of thinking the right way. I actually take it in the opposite direction, which is we're not thinking enough maybe about the complementarities, about employment opportunities, about new firm growth. But we're also, I think, not thinking about the nature of innovation in these companies. So one of the reasons that people become entrepreneurs, they can't work very effectively with that type of disruptive innovation in large organizations. So anyone who works at a research university understands how difficult it is to create change in a research university because of all kinds of structures. And it's the same thing for for-profit companies, right? You can't basically go all or nothing for some kind of 8x return in a large company, particularly not a publicly traded company. So the kind of research we get tends to be more incremental innovation. We see this in biotech, for example, in pharma. No one's going to say, I'm going to plunk $800 million on all or nothing innovation. Instead, we essentially outsource it. So Carmelo, to your point of sort of how do we think about boundaries of the firm, we basically outsource that initial innovation, and we do so willingly because it's easier to do that kind of innovation. So what's the alternative? If you create limits on mergers, it's not like we say, okay, that was 3% of the merger budget that we're going to move to R&D. We're not going to get the same kind of innovation. We may get innovation, but it's not the transformative innovation. And so I worry very much about those issues. I also think we don't spend enough time sort of thinking of the unique characteristics of certain firms and the value creation that they might have in terms of asset specificity for certain acquisitions. So, we think about this in the finance literature of a strategic buyer versus a financial buyer. Broadly, we don't think enough about it specifically in the platform context. Why is it that we might acquire firms? So let me give you an example. So Uber acquired Drizzly. So you'd say this is a beautiful compliment. Uber Eats and we add beer delivery. Who would have thought alcohol and food goes well together? It does. The reason why Uber does an acquisition is because Drizzly has something that they don't have, which is a lot of regulatory approvals for transportation of alcohol. I don't know how it is in Europe, but in the United States, it's a disaster going back to prohibition, sometimes 3 tiers of regulation. And the value add there is simply Uber can do this literally with 3 years worth of work, or we could actually take it to Toby's point of before in say telecom. This reminds me very much of why it was that BlackBerry wanted to acquire Iridium, because they had unique, I'm sorry, not BlackBerry, Motorola wanted to acquire Iridium. Why? Because they understood the regulatory process better and they thought that they could create value from it. So this is, I think, what's been missing in the debate. So if we are looking beyond a narrow vision of welfare, to Michael's point, then Michael Jacobides' point, then what we need to do is also focus in part on the value creation aspect. And that, I think, has been missing from the debate, and that hasn't really been teased out enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are ending. So we're running a bit out of time here. It's kind of normal sometimes when we get with this expected when we get with this such interactive and interesting points. But because it was also to give the time to our last speaker, Martin Thelle from Implement Economics, particularly if you want, more on the discussion of what do we take out of this, when it comes to implementing on the implementation side. And this is also what Danny was calling in, with the impact on, beyond just, the few players that will be regulated, or, more economy that runs, aside this. And Martin has also, many years of experience, been working also with regulators on regulated industry, from networks to utilities. So I think you are well placed to give us, some final remarks on this panel from your side. Thank you, Martin, for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity, Carmelo, and thank you to all the speakers. It's been a true pleasure spending a Friday afternoon refreshing your brain and getting lots of new ideas. What I'll try to do is just share with you what's on my block of paper, a few reflections. In the time before the coffee break, very interesting thoughts on the ecosystems and an encouragement for national competition regulators to step up their thinking and their approach to this. Otherwise, they would be overhauled by sector regulation. Maybe this is indeed what we are seeing happening right now in front of our eyes. I also heard Jacobides saying that the simple and implementable threshold of the DMA, we should, the previous speakers talked about walking before running, but Jacobides actually said we should run away from this as fast as we could, because he thought it had to be misguided principle of identifying the gatekeepers. I also heard that then other principles should be put in place instead of those rather simple thresholds, and combining the inputs from those aspects, I was left with a great amount of sympathy and understanding for how complex the understanding of competition in this area really is. But I also wanted to give some pushback from a practical perspective, because if we want to put those all of those, that good material thinking into principles that is a first screening for at all being able to regulate afterwards, and with challenges of giving legal certainty to not only to platforms, but also actually trying to achieve what I believe is what the DMA is truly trying to achieve, putting all of that very demanding complex analysis up front before you can actually use the directive. I think it would actually do more harm than good, and that's the fun of being in practice, is that you are quite often choosing between not first best or second best, but you are quite down the line in comparing, what is worst, number 3 or number 4, and if number 4 is something complex that gets us, stalled before we get started, I would be practical and say, thresholds, they can be discussed, where should it be, but they should be seen in the context of what you want to do with the companies afterwards. So that's why I'm trying to tie together what we discussed in the morning of the identification of gatekeepers. You need to understand that in the context of what will the regulation do once you have identified those you want to regulate. And that's where at least I give you my simple high level understanding of a very complex proposal, because the way I read it, and I haven't read all the details, but the way I would basically posit it would be to say the DMA is just trying to make stuff and rules that are well accepted, and they're actually there already. You can ask Google about the shopping case, as even before there was a draft of the DMA, it was perceived as illegal or at least questionable to give preference to your own services. And that was on the basis of other legislation that was there already. So the DMA, I don't see it as introducing some new regulation that's not there, but I see it as an attempt to make it easier to enforce and lower the burden of proof for those being affected by a potential abuse. So for example, one of the obligations, if you can identify it, is that yes, you should do what you already should do. But what it does, it lowers the burden of proof if you are affected by that type of abuse. It lowers the burden of proof because you can just point to the DMA if it was implemented and say, you know, you are a gatekeeper. There's no discussion. It's simple. And I think you are favoring your own rankings or whatever application you want to use. And that lowers, because that's enormously difficult and tricky and burdensome just to prove that, yes, you are dominant. But you will take away that part of the work. And also to say that this is an abuse, because it's written there that this, you cannot do it. If you're gatekeeper, you cannot do this. So that is facilitating.
Okay. So let me push back on this,
yeah.
Because I mean, you have an interesting point here, and of course, I mean, you know, practicalities and, you know, is part of also, you know, of the economics of law, right? But then the question is, isn't this too practical? I mean, too pragmatic, right? So you're lowering the barriers to, you know, for those, you know, to claim against. But, you know, some of the arguments here will say that, you know, in some cases, this is actually good. I mean, it's driving value creation without harming, you know, anybody. But you open instead doors by doing that, right? For some free riding, some, you know, incentivizing some, you know, innovation activity. While in other cases, I mean, this is actually good because then, you know, we do have, you know, problems that are, you know, structural. So, you know, from a practical point of view, how do you tease this out?
Yeah, but I fully agree that with the approach that is here, you probably have something that is too crude, so you will catch too many false negatives in a crude approach. Could then you know, how do we solve that problem with the approach? And I'm not here to just defend the DMA. I'm just trying to put some context to our common understanding and discussion of it. But maybe those issues could be treated not by changing the simple identification principles, but rather in the application of, so when you do then an assessment, did you actually harm consumers by that conduct? So for each of the obligations, there would be a guidance and a principle that would follow that. So I think that would be the normal nature of things. That so here's the act. It's put into force. Then there would be guiding principles for dealing with each of the items. And in there you could then develop the test, just like there's a test for assessing whether a merger should go through that. There's a process and so forth. You could have, of course, not the same process, but a different guidance on how to deal with that, taking that issue on a more case-by-case basis. But so that would avoid the negative consequences, but without destroying the benefit of lowering the legal burden of proof for those feeling inflicted by not having those. A reflection.
Yes.
Let me see.
And we are running out of time, so we close remark really. Or
I will. I was really encouraged by the 3 recommendations by Marshall. The access to data, you know, that would be considered, I think, a very, very intruding type of regulation. So I can perfectly understand from a person's perspective that that's not where you would want to start. First time you want to regulate this, you want to move in slowly and gently and just putting around the frames for enforcing what you're already enforcing. But this proposal to create access for data, that would be very intruding. So I would think 3-4 generations down the line before even discussing that. The merger control taking alternative configuration into, I think that would be sort of interfering with the market should figure out who is the best buyer, and then they see clearance. It should not be a criteria in mergers whether someone else should have bought this. The market should decide. What I found a bit not represented in the debate is actually discussion around killer acquisitions and the new guidance that was issued earlier this year by the Commission to actually issue guidance on mergers below the threshold, which is definitely happening in this space as well. So I think actually that piece of regulation in itself could address some of the main concerns seen from my side in this space when it comes to merger, namely the problem of killer acquisitions. So just a short remark. Self-regulation was super interesting, and you talked about effective self-regulation. And I just noted here that our former Prime Minister, Ms. Helle Thorning-Schmidt, she is actually on the oversight board of Facebook. So that's some kind of self-regulation. Maybe it's not effective. I don't know. But I think it is, of course, always relevant to ask, and also in the context of the DMA, are there things that we can carve out where regulation is not the right choice to solve a particular problem? And maybe for the problems around intermediation and misinformation, maybe self-regulation is a better choice, and maybe it should be carved out of the DMA to be treated in a less intruding way. I think that's a reasonable question. Can we learn from utilities? I heard the answer is no. I would also say no, we cannot. This is an entirely different animal. And then I understood from the last that data cannot just be seen per se as a resource. It needs to be understood in the context how it is embedded in the organization and with the algorithm. So maybe you're not solving it with data portability questions. Those were my notes.
Your notes. Terrific. I think that this summarizes very well what we have learned and debated today. Obviously, we're not going to solve issues today. We actually open up more questions, and that was part of the intent with the forum today. And I thank you all, particularly the panelists, for joining us. Michael, who is with us, the rest of the crew, those that are still with us, online. And thank you all for joining the conversation. Please keep on with this conversation. We will do here over drinks. And unfortunately, we did not have the pleasure to have you guys here, but hopefully next time. So thank you again, and enjoy also the rest of the evening and weekend.
Thank you so much.